ディスカッションを始めますが、ディスカッションの前にそれぞれプレゼンテーションをしてもらいます。で、今回先ほど発表したように東大の新しいアドバンスリサーチプログラムというものを、今、準備をしているんですが、そこで批評というものを今まで日本はですね、批評というのが、磯崎さんの頃は結構80年代一時期元気があった時代があるんですが、その後批評というものが非常に弱くなった。で、今世界の、建築の、セオリー、批評をリードしている、今日、人数5人、来ていただいて、その方たちに発表して、その後ディスカッションというふうに、したいと思います。As I want to start now, as we invite the five best, as a critic, historian, something from the world, and it is an annihilation of the new education program of Tokyo University. As for Tokyo University, such kind of event is very important. And last 20 years, Japan is very quiet, especially for the architectural criticism. It has been very weak, I think. But now we want to change that situation, and this is as a kind of starting of the new direction of Japanese education, I believe. Then those I must those.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming today. The number of events are stacked today, and so this is the last of the 4 events that we started at 12 o'clock this afternoon, including Princeton's and Tokyo University's studio presentation. Now, before I will hand my mic to Brett, he's going to be coordinating, moderating today's presentation as well as discussion. There are a few things are integrated into this particular event today. This is a diagram that I showed earlier, but let me just quickly illustrate what this event means to Tokyo University and also what it means. And of course, this is the book launch with Jesse Nanako's 014 book, but using that book publication as a means to contextualize how to talk about architecture beyond just the construction of the building, how to theorize it, how to put it in context historically, as well as within the criticism. So what we are trying to, this is still at the planning stage, so I cannot guarantee this is exactly going to happen, but we are launching a different laboratory. Laboratory is the kind of specific research targeting particular output. So we have spoken this afternoon about digital fabrication. It's really about outputting one-to-one construction as well as sustainable prototyping. That is the outputting through the design proposal. And what we are launching is still in the planning stage, is called Media Initiative, which perhaps is relatively common in the West, but however here in Japan, this medium of things like publication, exhibition, as well as symposium seems to be the platform to just talk about the project, but it doesn't really allow all these ideas being explored into the coherent direction and the projection for the architectural discourse. So we try to, within Tokyo University, not only about establishing printing studio or some sort of exhibition people organize, how do you use these media as a way to explore as a form of research. So we are establishing this media initiative as a form of laboratory. In addition, there's a professional practice. This is a kind of conventional way that Japanese laboratories are being organized. But we would like to further push that to see how the practice of actual constructing and designing the building could also be organized as more rigorous research, and as well as social design, and how the local community could now begin to participate within the research at the University of Tokyo. So there are a number of labs that are being launched, and this is those digital fabrication. This, as I said, launched about a year and a half ago. Sustainable prototyping we will launch today. So media initiative is the one that we've been planning. So today's discussion is really about how these media, books, symposia, as well as exhibition, has a way to create particular research platform. So as I said, it hasn't started. So today's discussion gives us a platform to explore. So quickly, this is, yes, so this media initiative lab, so the different laboratory within Tokyo University has an ability to integrate into the larger framework, but the output would be a books, symposia, as well as exhibition. And the Princeton University has been quite instrumental, not only for the studio project, but also in a particular context, because of strengths in Princeton as in history and theory, that perhaps we can begin to collaborate in order to find a direction within the common project. So this is perhaps for the Japanese audience. Typically, architectural research is understood as production of the building. Anything beyond that, including a representation, is still aiming towards the building, very practical understanding. However, this dimension of idea or theory, this often lacks perhaps in Japanese context. So it wasn't the case perhaps before about how do you bring these idea of theory, it became idea, but it means to be a theory, become part of our next. So this medium zone symposium, books, lecture, exhibition as a media initiative is something that we would like to explore in the future. So with that, I'm going to hand mic to Brett, and he's going to talk about his work as well as a way to introduce the rest of the guests today. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuke.
While they're sitting, there is a book sale at the end, so stick around for those who are interested in purchasing.
I'll show you to begin the day, as both editor and publisher of this beautiful book, which is going to be today's topic for this session.
That's an autograph stamp.
Exactly. No, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming in, and it's a pleasure to moderate a session which is going to discuss this book, its production, its reception, and talk a little bit about the broader theme that you all are interested in, which is the ways in which schools of architecture, like universities, don't just produce knowledge, but can see the task of the dissemination of that knowledge with all of its complexities and surprises as part of the work that you do here at a school like this. With the sort of general backdrop that's been set up, I think I'll just jump right into my brief introduction, and as editor, one of the presentations that we made in this session. I think the questions that you all are looking at, the questions of a symposium, the role of a symposium, the idea of public audiences in school are certainly questions that we hold close to heart back in London, and in fact that's part of what's going to drive the presentation I put together. In terms of how we've organized this session, what we thought we would do is keep things pretty factual and simple, which is in effect just a series of presentations that follow the model of how the book 014 is itself organized. Contributions by not just the architects involved, but myself as an editor, Jeff Kipnis as a critic, Sanford Quinter, who is our missing theorist today, and like many theorists is back at home writing a book as we speak, and Sylvia Lavin, a historian who's going to do some history as part of her presentation here this afternoon. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to each wear a single hat, although I think as most of you will know, all of us could probably swap hats and likely will over the next hour or two here this evening. But that's the basic kind of setup to get things going. Before I begin, first just to thank Kuma-san for the invitation. I think it's especially meaningful for me to come back 5 years after the kind of questions that are being asked today are exactly the ones that he and I worked on in the publication of one of his books in English. We had an opportunity as part of a series that I'll show in a few minutes of small books that we produce in London to bring what I think is an incredibly important text in contemporary Japanese architecture to the English language, which we did about 5 years ago, and in fact started a conversation that in an interesting way has been looping through many things we do, and will offer another chance today, I think, for some of the same conversation to continue to carry forward. For the purposes of giving this session a little bit of a title, I've picked one a little bit out of the blue, although it's the title of a book by someone I think about nearly every time that I fly into Japan, someone named Donna Haraway, who's thought by many to be one of the real pioneers of something that these days is referred to as post-humanist studies, post-humanism. Haraway, of course, 20 years ago, is the author of both a famous and infamous text called the Cyborg Manifesto, which every time I land in Tokyo comes to mind almost automatically, to the extent to which you all continue to live in the future, for those of us in old-fashioned places like Europe. Anyway, in 2008, Haraway released a collection of quite peculiar and slightly random essays that include everything from remarks on her father, a sports writer, to her dog, feral cats, and the wildlife that eats them in her California house. And in that book, the point that she makes is that any idea we might have today for a kind of other globalization, which she calls ultra globalization, will depend ultimately on our ability as a species to acknowledge the fact that there are other minds in the world than just our own. And I think in a way that idea of multiple species is a nice way to think about what the culture of architecture might be like today, in which a field like architecture can no longer be thought of as a field organized by a single figure, a figure like the architect, but most certainly in the early 21st century, a kind of ecology of participants that include not just engineers and clients, but all of those people like historians, like critics, like theorists, and others who contribute to the shaping of what we think of as an architectural mind. What Haraway writes at the beginning of this collection of essays is this: figures are not representations or didactic illustrations, but rather material nodes in which diverse bodies and meanings co-shape one another. And I think that'll be the kind of tenor I try and bring to these remarks about the way in which the various contributors to this lovely book give us a way to think about the figure of an architect and not just a form of knowledge like architecture in a slightly different way. So first obvious question for you all, and I'm sure it's already stated in different ways: why are we all here? Why are we here presenting a book by architects in New York about a building in Dubai published by a school in London for you all in Tokyo? I think other than the fact that we clearly embody all of the complexities of a continuously globalizing form of knowledge like architecture, I think what you'll find in the different presentations is an attempt to see a purpose to that that's something other than simple embodiment of our time. In fact, it's fair to say that architecture, as we know, is one of the world's great globalizing forces. Always has been, from the moment it's been codified and put in forms that would allow the ideas to travel far faster than many other bodies. And I think one of the questions today is how the nature of globalization that we all are confronting and a part of might operate both alike and in some ways differently from the kind of globalization that's long been built into architecture. It's fair to say that books are always in some way a secret of any architectural experience. In literal terms, this is a photograph. It's actually a kind of X-ray of the school that I just came from in London, in which you'll see, of course, in quite literal terms, in the geographic center of both plan and section, a bunch of rooms with books piled to the ceiling. As you can imagine, with a school as old as ours, that we're running out of space to store the books. In fact, one of the interesting things about schools of architecture is how they emerge out of almost the very instinct that we could associate with both the production and the storage or repository of book knowledge. If you go back and look at the history of the Architectural Association, one of its curiosities, and this is a book that's published only 14 years after the AA is created, is that it's in the book publishing business straight away. In fact, that's what it did for the better part of a half a century before it launched something like a full-time school. It was nearly 40 years from the publication of that book before a school launched in London at the AA, and one of the interesting things about the early years of it, like other schools, is the extent to which its participants are totally obsessed with the making and circulating of books. In the early years of the 20th century, of the 19th century, in fact, the association by 1850 to 1855 is being visited by figures like John Ruskin in the lower part of that picture. Famous, of course, as an author, very much more than as an architect. He was the first celebrity lecturer in the AA public program in 1853. And one of his acolytes, just above him there, Walter Crane, by the 1890s is being commissioned to design the logo and the graphic design of an association that still doesn't have, in the 1890s, a school of any kind. And one of the interesting things about a school like the AA is the extent to which it's organized itself in both the acceptance of and rejection of various documents that we think of as architectural monographs. In the 1930s, famously, the school works very hard to keep the author of this pamphlet out of the United Kingdom for his promotion of architecture or revolution, which to an English audience in the 1930s, the school wasn't much of a fan of. And in fact, at exactly that time, the school is organizing events like this to show their dedication to arts and craft. Book production in the 1930s, literally exhibitions of calligraphers and manuscript illuminators trying to carry forward a 19th century tradition that the school had been organized around. Interestingly, it was only at the invitation of students at the school in the 1940s and not my predecessors or the faculty of the school that Le Corbusier did finally visit the AA. And in fact, this was his opening line to a lecture of students. In 1947, I do not want to talk about architecture. I detest talk about architecture. He, of course, then went on for several hours and did nothing but talk about architecture. About 30 years, 25 years after that, students at the AA are literally producing books as their final thesis projects. In the diploma school, this famous pamphlet, an A4 document by Rem Koolhaas in his 5th year titled Exodus, or the Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture, demonstrates the extent to which, even in the most unexpected and the most revolutionary of decades in the 20th century, the traditional classical belief in the production of books guides the reinvention of architecture. And literally, with Rem's writing down of both his tutor's name and their partners, the 4 names that found an office called the Office of Metropolitan Architecture, what we see is, of course, the role that plays in constructing the identity of an architect and not just setting up the principles for how they would practice. This is one of the rare photographs of that quartet at the time in the 1970s, and as I was looking at it this morning, I had to highlight for you because it's the only time you'll ever see Rem Koolhaas carrying a briefcase. Exactly what those partners looked like as he was completing his studies. And if you jump ahead about 20 years, what's interesting is, of course, the absolute sheer mass industrialization of book production that takes place now amongst all of our students. This is the final year of my workspace in the Design Research Lab, about 5 years into the self-publishing frenzy that the computer delivered to studios worldwide. I think there was a great deal of discussion at the original appearance of personal computing in studios as changing the basis for architectural form or thinking. In fact, what it really did was dramatically accelerate the most traditional of all architectural activities, which is, of course, the production of monographs. And if I jump forward another 15 years, a photograph that I took in 2012 at the end of a long period of reorganizing the interior life of the school, the first of a decade-long series of building projects featured, I think somewhat unsurprisingly, the opening up of a new bookshop for students and staff of the school before we got on to the other kind of changes that we'll be bringing to some of the learning spaces in the next few years. So, if you stand back slightly from that kind of very personal overview, what you see is really just a very local, specific example of this kind of reality. In that field we think of as architecture and its peculiar forms of knowledge. That is a discipline organized literally around the production of books. There are very few fields like architecture whose absolute origin can be pinpointed to the very minute in which this young Roman architect on the right here stood up and presented a book called De Architectura to the Roman emperor of the time that he dedicated it to in the preface of his 10 books. Marcus Vitruvius Pollio was a relatively unknown Roman soldier who had collected a lifetime's experience, codified it into a series of books, and delivers, and it's the only remaining text from the Antiquities, a document that architecture is organized around for the coming centuries, in fact 2 millennia. It's a book that's rediscovered 1400 years later in Renaissance Italy and translated the first of many, many times as a basis for architects reflecting upon not just the origin, but what would then become the history of its field. And by the way, for students looking at the picture, the interesting bit, if you look at the emperor who tends to get all of the attention after the architect, the interesting bit in the photo is, of course, you realize the extent to which what we call the jury system is itself built into the origin of the field. In fact, the incredibly episodic idea that architecture knowledge is only ever gained one project at a time in both its production and presentation is absolutely affirmed in this incredible etching. For the other tip for students is, of course, to look in the dark shadows to see the guys whispering in the background, or the roadies in the distance, to realize that's almost always where the trouble lies in these kind of presentations. And even in the popular imagination of that event, if you look at something like Dan Brown's version of Vitruvius's text, in 2003, the great Da Vinci Code, which opens with a scene in which a curator at the Louvre is found dead and naked, splayed in the pose of the Vitruvian man, from which the mystery then untangles. What we find is, of course, the idea of the architect and his or her body lying at the absolute center of not just architectural knowledge, but a larger understanding or explanation of the cosmos. And this kind of secret life in architecture is the thing that's been carried forward over and over again in the production and dissemination of monographs throughout the century. And in fact, you could perform a kind of call and row exercise, very much like he did in comparing Le Corbusier to Palladio. If you were to look only at the production of books, what you find is almost a complete collapse between the modernism of the Bauhaus, which you can see up here in examples from their book series, and the kind of 19th century text that they were rejecting in order to produce these books. One of the striking features of modern architecture is, in fact, its arrival and acceleration alongside the industrialization of the printed word and the printed book. And it's not an exaggeration to say that modernism, modern architecture, is invented and promoted by editors much more than architects or builders. Not just Le Corbusier, who might be the most extreme example, but someone like Mies, whose seminal period, let's say in his transition, occurs at that time in which he's briefly the editor of a small journal in Germany, and many, many others at that time who are laying out the principles and then disseminating them through this new medium of the printed page that can be widely disseminated. As Nietzsche said in the 1890s, the mask one adopts when entering a profession eventually becomes one's genuine face. This photograph of Le Corbusier editing one of his 57 books is exactly a record of that. Indeed, the pseudonym that he takes from his born name is that he declares on the first page of the first issue of L'Esprit Nouveau, Le Corbusier, which as he becomes known for it as an editor, he says eventually he has to accept as his name as an architect. That's a backdrop, really, to the kind of interest that we had in carrying forward the commitment that Jesse and Nanako have long had in the dissemination and production of ideas around their architecture. You could say in the 1990s, what you see emerge is a kind of monograph that records first projects. A few years later, in a beautiful little manifesto in 2006 titled Atlas of Novel Tectonics, what you see is a declaration of first principles that are derived out of those projects, the challenge and exercise in 014 was basically to see whether all of their prayers come true in a first large-scale project that they're commissioned to undertake at rapid speed, and to a certain degree with limited knowledge of exactly what can be done and the time constraints and others that are given. So that's really the backdrop, and what I'd like to do is just finish with what I've decided, for lack of a better term, to call editorial truisms, and list just 5 of the most obvious ones, I think, that came up as we were working on the book. Something that I could say is very much the outcome of having produced the book and not having read it. I think editorial work is slightly different than other forms of labor, mental or manual, that you think of as an architect. But that's what I'd like to offer, is this sort of slightly skewed view of how this book came together from the perspective of London for us. I think I became an editor about 10 years ago, and like most things in life, did it by looking at pictures of how other people did it, and imagined it was a pretty interesting life. This is Walter Gropius living life as I thought editors lived it in the 1950s. In fact, it was only last night as I was looking at the picture again and looked at these shadows here and here to realize there's a light here and another light here, and this image that was published in Life magazine, that I realized what a setup it was. Editing really isn't a job where you walk around your house dressed in a suit with a cravat, with a lovely assistant in the background reclining in furniture that you've designed, waiting for you to finish your day. You can carry on the conversation. It's actually a much messier, slightly frantic activity. A kind of constant mill of sorting and shuffling papers, which you do physically for part of the day, and when you have time, you then do it mentally with the rest of the day, in the reorganization of words and sentences and other material that end up making up books. These are edited manuscripts by 2 of my favorite writers. Opening pages by J.G. Ballard on the right, and on the left, Don DeNola. For any of you architecture students that are uncertain in your views, have confidence that if these guys are like that, it's okay for the rest of us to second guess things. As editorial models go, I suppose one of the interesting things in late modern life is the extent to which the editor has crept in and taken over the life of who we used to think of as the author. If you need, let's say, bibliographic proof of the death of the authors, you need look only at the career of Gordon Lish, one of the world's great editors, who famously edited Raymond Carver's writings down so much, and this is an example, that there was very little Carver left at the end of the day. Something that Lish was immediately quite heavily criticized for before going on forming his own career that to a very great degree surpasses that of Carver. His edits are famously so brutal with the writings of Carver that, as this line that I've highlighted points out, that when Carver did switch editors and Lish left and another editor came in, everybody assumed that it was a change in writing style by Carver. He then rehired Lish and carried on. This is a little parody that Lish himself wrote about Raymond Carver's life, demonstrating the extent to which an editor can change the life and tone of a text. The striking feature of editorial activity is its iterative nature, the degree to which you go through draft after draft after draft to shape a text. It's that iterative structure that, for me, offers the basis of a first truism. Something that it took me a few years to learn, the idea that texts are only ever serial events. You don't make books once, even if they're at a certain stage in which they're published, but that books are always, and in this way, like buildings by architects, part of a larger series. That seriality, I think, was one question we thought through as we came to the topic of 014 and how to publish a project like this by RUR, an office and a body of ideas that I think many of us know because of the fantastic drawings like the one on the right here that Jesse and Nanako did working with Jeff, a famous project in the 1990s, a water garden. One of the questions that relationship begs is what's real and what's not in a career like this. I think given the formative effect that images and diagrams can play, of course, but I was imagining starting to play through at the stage they're at in their careers exactly that kind of moment in a career like this one, in which what we take to be the architectural knowledge really does sit somewhere between the real lived experience and an ability to communicate it in ways in which it transforms how architects think about their culture. Very little literal comparison between the two, however much Le Corbusier said his Maison Domino was derived directly from his building of a small house in the Swiss Alps. Interestingly, that Maison Domino is the second in the series of books that we're doing that this 014 catalog presented for us. We're developing a project right now leading up to the 2014 100th anniversary of the Maison Domino, arguably the most influential of all single projects in the 20th century, and is an example of exactly the kind of thing that's being influenced going experience in 014. In fact, it's this sort of serial quality of that building that I think first drew our attention to its peculiar kind of role within this larger idea of architectural knowledge unfolding in serial fashions. The next book in the series, I just wanted to give you a little highlight on how the influence is going forward and it doesn't just come from the past, is a very odd manipulation of that very domino frame by a man named Dominique Boudet, who commissions OMA early in their career for a first ever building. And we're structuring that project very much as if a kind of detective story, because all we have is the early archival material from the original photography and drawings of the building, which have so many errors in it that the only thing we could do is to try and put together a book that lets the reader try and find an answer to questions that neither the client nor the architect seems to have any explanation of. We're modeling it, if you can see in the upper right corner, on the detective novels of Dennis Wheatley in the 1930s, who simply put a bunch of evidence together and bound it and called it a detective novel and left it to the reader to try and figure out what it all means. So all the images on the right, you could say, are books being influenced by the experience we had in the last year or two in 014. On the left, by contrast, are exactly those kind of texts that you could say influenced our shaping of the book. Conversations that started with Jesse and I about 3 years ago, in which I basically began the process by asking him what his favorite books are, which he was happy to begin to share with us. Duchamp's Box in a Valise, a fantastic book on Miyake, as I expected but never fully understood, a book on airplanes, which offered both typographic and visual ideas for how we ended up laying out the book. Truism 2, make books difficult by design. I think not enough effort is made to really make books difficult for their readers, which seems to me always an obvious thing to do considering how hard it is to make the books themselves. To give you an example from our own recent collection of books, in physical terms, making a book difficult, what we used for this book called Translated By, which is a collection of contemporary novelists writing on architecture in their novels, is a 19th century technique of what are called unopened signatures, where you have to cut the book open in order to read it. Was based on a line I once came across in an F. Scott Fitzgerald novel, The Great Gatsby, in which a character derides Gatsby for having a series of unopened books, and of course realizes the books are just a showpiece for the character's life. In 014, you could say the difficulty we tried to introduce to the book was in fact structuring it in such a way that it exists more like an index than a kind of conventional narrative or classical beginning, middle, or end. And ask the reader to, in effect, chart the path through it. Third truism, which also I think ended up playing a part in how we thought about the physical organization of 014, let the form of a project tell you about the shape of its pages. To give you a little example of one that I produced a few years ago, after working with a team for 1.5 years on continuous surface modeling and trying to make sense out of what these sort of texts actually say to a non-expert like me, the best I could come up with was trying to shape the physical form of the book as a continuation of the project itself. We vacuum formed the case for it in such a way that all of the pages ended up having to deform themselves into the packaging. At the other extreme of that game between physical form and content is this one, a book that we released 10 days ago called Dogma 11 Projects, a decade-long retrospective of a studio in Brussels, led by a devout Marxist who wanted to make an affordable book for the proletariat, which led us to make the most expensive book we've ever produced, which I'm pleased to say sold out on the first evening at 75 pounds a copy. When we came to the question, I think, of how to organize the monograph for 014, what we became interested in is the idea of taking the signature feature of the project, the incredible load-bearing structure, that the concrete frame that wraps around the building, and doing the same thing with the book. In effect, taking it and wrapping it around the book and allowing it to enclose the hard copy in the very same form that we felt like the building itself was doing. One of the things that interests me in that kind of a project is the way in which the figure of the building can become the figure of the book. And what in narratology is referred to as metalepsis, the idea of a figure finding themselves unexpectedly in a different logical space of a story, when an author is written into as a character of a novel. Something that has a peculiar and interesting modern history in architecture, but almost always around the figure of the architect. One of the things we're experimenting with is the way in which that figure can be the building of the project being documented in a series like this. Truism 4, I've just got 2 to go here. Truism 4, books are the means by which architects can design time and space. The interesting feature of books is simply how hard they are and how long they take to produce. You say for almost all architects, time goes too fast, right? And particularly in a world like ours, in which time is constantly escalating. I've got a wonderful example of an architect's frustration with time going too fast here with this picture of Le Corbusier in a slightly awkward position with his favorite dog, a dog that he really liked. And when that dog died, found itself bound to one of books in Le Corbusier's collection. I think, you know, there could be a lot of psychological analysis of exactly what's going on here, and I'm going to let you go at it, but I think what it's really an expression of more than anything is simply the sheer sadness of how fast time goes by for an architect. Right? And animals or pets' lives, to go back to Haraway, are an absolutely certain reminder of that. One of the sub-theories of that truism is always get the autograph. I said that before we put this book upstairs on sale later. I think, for me, the autograph isn't so much a way to increase value, almost it certainly does it, as it is a way of simply recording a moment in time in which something comes into your life. That's a lovely mock-up of a book we did a couple of years ago with all 85 authors autographing the cover for me. Truism 5, the last truism. Embrace piracy, it's the new gravity. It's everywhere. The book on the left I released on June in 2010. By August, the book on the right is being sold by unknown publishers on the streets of Shanghai. Something that as a young editor or author really pisses you off until you see it like 500 times, and then it's just like part of life. This book, which I poured 3 years into as my first collection, was sent to me as a stack of about 15 in a brown paper envelope 2 years later. The scale of that kind of dissemination only ever accelerating. From the hard copy to now the 20-year DVD set of El Croquis available for £8 at any architecture conference you go to in Beijing. I bought this copy from the Museum of Modern Art in Beijing. The first sleeve of this page had an instruction and a phone number to call if you wanted hard copies delivered to your hotel room, which they did overnight. We're haven't yet figured out a way to really compete so much as try and learn from the experience of unauthorized exchange. Got in no trouble at all for the flag that one of my teams made, but this image upset our hosts in Beijing in 2009, which is a suggestion that I was making at the end of the presentation that Mao had learned how to pose for his statues by reading Le Corbusier carefully. The next series, the next volume in this little series of beautiful words books that we began with Kuma-san's book in 2008 is an unauthorized English translation of Mao's writings between 1949 and 1974, which he uses architecture over and over again for the obvious propaganda purposes that you can imagine. I think the only point I would make in that final truism is simply that we have reached a moment in which piracy and the unauthorized reproduction and dissemination of material is no longer a threat unless we choose to continue to view it that way legally or otherwise. And what I would suggest as an antidote to the kind of everyday view would be something like Adrian John's fantastic book on the history of intellectual property that traces through 500 years of the way in which architecture and other fields were shaped through the unauthorized duplication of its manuscripts, in which a conventional view of the Enlightenment that only the best ideas travel around is absolutely confounded by evidence in which simply the most easily copied texts became the ones that were then used to organize entire fields of disciplines. In relation to 014 and on that final truism point, I think for me, what I tried to work through with the small essay that I contributed was the extent to which 014 can be seen as an absolute and outright borrower of every iconic tower of the 20th century. The only twist is that it doesn't look like any of those buildings. It undertakes that operation through a kind of inversion of principles. Subpoint to that truism is, of course, a realization that indeed, and if this is one of the broader themes of the school now, the question of publications and their role in a school is to realize that the dominant building material of the 20th century and of 20th century architectural culture isn't glass, it isn't steel, it's the printed page. It's the means by which, in the invention of the modern architectural monograph, ideas are developed, promoted, transferred, and generally disseminated throughout architectural culture. The history of those books, from Frank Lloyd Wright at the beginning of the 20th century to Rem Koolhaas at the end, is a series of continual technical and mechanical evolutions that take place within it. I found this image confirming the peculiar state that got to a few years ago. This is the 1989 first ever sketch of SML XL, a book that they worked on in the office for nearly 6 years, longer than most of their largest projects, before delivering it in 1995. It's an interesting office that's organized around the production of books and knowledge as part of its work, and I think one of the interesting things is how that moment in the 90s, and this was an immediate context through which we thought the question of RUR's book here, how that 20th century monograph was coming to a kind of end. This is a still, actually, of a pair of SML XLs burning in a video that an applicant to the school sent me in 1989. Clearly a generation was waking up to a slight unease with that form. Wonderful collection of those kind of images over the last few years. Interestingly, what happened in 1995 and the release of the World Wide Web wasn't the death of the monograph. It was, interestingly, the death of other ancillary media like this guy. The magazine, the Modern Architectural Magazine, which ended up closing quite soon after and ending a century of women selling architecture in men's magazines. And it was, in fact, one of the secret ideas in 014 was the use of a kind of magazine advertisement opening to try and set up what would then become a much more straightforward text afterwards. Final truism is, I think by now, you can see the larger theme of this quick summary, which is simply that architecture books do continue to be the means by which architects can change architectural minds. And I was trying to think of an example to show that, and I thought I would turn to what we did a few years ago, working with Kuma-san here on a wonderful project, which was a translation of a text called Anti-Object. And if you look at Kuma-san's career, I think one of the compelling features of it is to look back 20 years and see on the left what he was doing, and if you look on the right, what he's working on right now, and was undoubtedly up all night in the studio working on. What sits between those two examples is, in fact, a text. A fantastic, fantastic long essay that he writes in 2000, in which he openly and quite dramatically reassesses his thinking and the ideas of what architecture is, and I think in incredibly kind of personal terms provides exactly the kind of means by which to open up the discussion around the things that he's interested in today. The absolute belief that the production of texts becomes a way to not only change the mind of those that confront them as readers, but also those of us involved in their production. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I thought actually we would have an audience of builders today, but in fact it seems more an audience of students. But in any case, many of you probably are not entirely familiar with the O14 Tower, so what I'm going to do is give a relatively short presentation of the building, and then I'm going to go into some of the arguments that developed out of the project. One of the things I would want to open with is really, how we use these books and how the book relates to the project of architecture. One of the things that we find, as designers, in approaching design in a very particular way, is that we are not conceptualists. Primarily, we find it absolutely essential to work back and forth between what the project as it develops tells us, and then so we have certain working assumptions. We start a design, go through the series of iterations that advance the design, but then I think it's very important to understand that the design actually develops something that you could not have thought of, and that then gets folded back into the way we think through the building and how we advance the project. So one of the peculiar aspects of that is that I constantly find that the writing we do is never really adequate to the work. That the work is always in some sense in advance of how we write about it. So the atlas that we produced about 6 years ago, and which I'll show very briefly, outlines a few arguments more or less tied to some maybe more juvenile obsessions about architecture, and then try to make those arguments commensurate with the projects. With O14 and the chance to do this book, it also was an opportunity to reassess a lot of the arguments from the first book. And so it's really a work in progress. That is the way we frame or theorize the project that we're involved in. And I have to say that what I'm going to show today is as much influenced by the writings of the contributors. The book is a frozen moment in time. The arguments keep going. And so, what I'll show today actually partially isn't even in the book that I hope you buy. Anyway, this is the O14 Tower. As most of you probably know, it's a 22-story office tower in Dubai. It's characterized by the exoskeleton shell structure instead of a frame structure. It has a 2-story podium at the base, which is actually an independent structure, mainly for larger programs, commercial programs, 4 floors of underground parking for 400 cars, and a supported shell. And so this notionally is the transformation from the frame structure that we started with to an exoskeleton. Of course, it's a fiction. It never mutated this way. But the idea was to kind of illustrate the shift in how we thought of the tower as we were designing it. There are byproducts to the exoskeleton. We moved it a meter away from the glazed enclosure of the building, and that brought about a whole series of consequences, one of them being this the possibility of harnessing to the stack effect of the building. So it has a sustainable dimension, but I hasten to say it's more the byproduct of another series of operations rather than going after the sustainable building to start with. We, of course, looked at many different ways of generating the form of the exoskeleton and actually how to produce it, working with these void forms, and then a whole other process, which is, of course, outlined in the book, of a series of construction, the mishaps as well as the successes in the development of the building, because it really was a kind of experiment, a work in progress that the developer very kindly tolerated. The building looking at its base, looking up, so you're under the podium, and creating these urban spaces to connect waterfront to the road behind. So I'm going to flash through these and get to the heart of the issue. As I said, it really books follow on books, and the arguments that we think really describe the project, your overall project, come to be questioned. And so this is the sort of opening salvo from 014. Actually, what motivated this piece of writing was another project by another architect. And it was Preston Scott Cohen's museum that we had the opportunity to be at the inauguration of. And I realized that, of course, when architects write about other architects are writing about themselves. And so this paragraph probably applies more to us than to Scott. But I think it was really a kind of moment when dealing with a project that was going to, it was really our first major project that we had to contend with in a very real way a lot of the assumptions we were making in the previous book. So the 014 book has, again, kind of retrospectively, a kind of master plan of concepts and of material levels and conceptual levels that are woven together. Of course, never designed with these diagrams. These were all retrospective. But going back, looking at those relationships as carefully as we can, trying to figure out what happened in the event. So I'm going to go through a series of arguments that we posed in the book. Again, not really trying to talk about the building, but more the arguments derived from. And the first one, again, starts with an argument that I always felt somewhat uneasy about in the Atlas, where the best we could do was to kind of find the the separation between the way an engineer thinks and the way an architect thinks in terms of some material difference or excess. So we show, for example, the catenary model of Gaudi, passing through the arch, the bearing masonry arch, and that everything outside of that line, in some sense, is excess, and that excess is the architecture. Well, yeah, maybe so, but that doesn't tell you very much. So, in thinking about what we were doing, we clearly began to realize that basing the work on a purely engineering logic had diminishing returns, and we were actually always in excess of that. So, and I guess Mies is probably not the greatest example of truth in structure per se, but the structure as a kind of essential description of loads on the one side, and then the use of symbolic structure, like in the Pazzi Chapel, the pilasters and all of the elaboration of symbolic structure, is something that we wanted to return to in some fashion, and we were always working with it. So the other part of it was this idea that nevertheless, we didn't want to make a hard split between that which, say, performed physically and that which could be seen as a cosmetic, as a surface effect. And then, there are some who would argue that an indexical project like the structural project is in great opposition to what happens on the surface. And I think this is a kind of illustration that, in fact, there's no contradiction at all. That, in fact, one is an enhancement of the other. Of course, we're not talking about simply seeing one thing as surface and the other as depth. That, in fact, the surface becomes the depth in this case, and gets put in the same kind of plane as which formerly could be seen as deeply structural and essential. The essential appears on the surface too. So, in looking back at some of the arguments for the Atlas with the rod net truss, we could extract out the minimal sort of force lines and create a truss, but then obviously that was a highly reductive kind of description of the situation. And what we wanted in terms of the effect of the envelope of the building was the multiplicity of very fine lines or elements, even though we knew very well that they probably weren't all performing as such, performing that is structurally. So this brings us in the book to this whole issue of the kind of the oscillation between the optical project, say in painting, how it's pulled into the project of architecture, or the most kind of reduced form of architecture being that of furniture. So Banham makes this wonderful argument about the move from the optical space of painting to the red and blue chair, which is perhaps the first physical embodiment of that relational space of the optical space, but also the point at which the project gets frozen, they get stuck. And so, as the argument goes, what was needed was the injection of another logic from outside of the optical. That is the material. So, through the Russian influences on Mark Stam, the kind of ossified relational composition of the red and blue chair is reinvigorated with a new sense of relational, relational, which was much more physical. So the introduction actually of the spring into the chair is that. So what we're arguing is that it becomes very useful to constantly oscillate back and forth between those conditions. So we can go back. We're heading now back towards appearance rather than the kind of essential structuring of it. And so that also connects to issues of redundancy for us. On the one hand, with O14, We assume that since we're using a kind of reticulated structure, that there's an inherent redundancy in that. This example of the airplane with most of the fuselage blown away and it's still holding together, speaks of that kind of redundancy. So there's the material side of redundancy, and then there's the optical side of that kind of excess. And we go through that. I won't go into great detail at all about it, but that the optical and the material are in constant exchange. And we also, kind of following from that, we're really interested in trying to open up, this question of the relationship of structure and skin, and of ornament and structure. And so, we set up a series of arguments very similar to that of the Atlas, but thinking through a kind of spectrum. On the one hand, the modernist model of structure and skin and bones. On the other side, structural expressionism, like in Calatrava. And what we are in now, I guess, is in this kind of condition of fictionalized fact, where surface kind of works back into depth, in a sense, are in some kind of tension in the project. We don't want to completely move to the purely cosmetic side. There's still some attachment to how the structure has a presence in the work, but nevertheless, much of it, can be seen as part of a fiction rather than as a purely, literally kind of indexical expression. The other part of the work was looking at the way the building was built, and one of the texts that came in again retrospectively was around this idea of the tectonic, and Gottfried Semper's famous writings on it, which I saw through Frampton. One of the issues there is the argument of a kind of transposition of the tectonic project from like a wood temple to the stereotomic project of the stone temple, and that was in a way a kind of project of transposition, transposing one kind of geometry, one kind of materiality into the other. And what we're talking about with 014 is not transposition, but a kind of transmission idea, where you get a kind of palpable sense of the network of structure behind all the concrete, and it's transmitted out through the layers of the concrete in the kind of surface expression or the animation of the skin. And that led us to some other kind of speculations on matter, going from a kind of purely indexical side, where you have angle of repose of sand on the one hand, with the addition of some materials that deal with, say, surface tension. There's the ability to produce another kind of form for architecture. And then finally, on the other end of the spectrum, a more idealist notion of impressing a geometry on a passive kind of substrate. And a similar set of arguments in painting, going from pure material flows on the one hand to taking that model of pure material flow and then constraining it in a representational system, like in the watercolor. So that led us to other speculations on the notion of an iconic building and of what seemed to be bubbling up not only in our projects but in those of our contemporaries about this notion of the aura, which of course was famously written about by Walter Benjamin. I won't go into those arguments because it takes too long. But I was really fascinated with this idea that Benjamin talks about the aura in relation to things like mountains, that it's about the immediacy of the effect, and the effect is that of a distance. And just in experience, started to think about works of art and our reception of them today, and of going, following the pilgrimage to the Louvre to go to see this work of art, realizing that it was limited in scale, it was abject, it was warped, it was old, and it was no longer filling the universe in the same way that the reproductions were. So I thought something was kind of, strange in this, something really interesting, something to think about. And then I realized that somehow in the work that our generation is doing, that there really are no originals anymore. We're dealing in iterative projects that are as much intertwined with images as they are with the actual material. And that it's actually even possible to produce those distancing effects in the building. So the experience of having the building look back at you, of it having this peculiar quasi-life, I think is a function of this new way of producing architecture. The other thing is, about the nature of the material itself of the architecture. And here I'm indebted to some of the issues that Jeff raises in his essay. And then I started to think through where our project is located relative to a few, somewhat old and very contemporary projects. The one on the left being the American Folk Art Museum by Williams and Chen, and that's, I think, one of the first projects where they realized that honesty of materials is just not doing it anymore. That there's a real anxiety, almost kind of hysteria about trying to reclaim presence and space and materiality in the city. And so they have to amp up the effects of the building's materiality beyond just presenting, the kind of the structures and the skins of modernism. On the other hand, another contemporary, really an old classmate, Hani Rashid's project, Hani and Lizanne's project, which attempts to kind of move to the opposite extreme. They're all material conditions, but here the immaterial dimension of the building is really foregrounded, as if it should leave its material condition and become a building of pure glow. So I think we find ourselves somewhere in between there. On the one hand, don't want to kind of overly express the materiality, or if that materiality is expressed, it's expressed through a kind of geometric abstraction, and to kind of work in that tension between the two models. And of course, it becomes more domesticated or charming in the Beatles version in the Sea of Holes, but it's actually about a kind of vertigo, I think, kind of being sucked up into this pattern that's has no up and no down, no left and no right. The other part of this is what the overall kind of trajectory of projects like this could mean. And in relation to 014, it's about a building that might be considered to be part of an overall cosmopolitan project for architecture. First slide here really just illustrates the very kind of tight group of architects and collaborators who were mainly distributed all over the place. The fewest people were actually those, the general contractor was located in Dubai, but everybody else actually was working remotely on this project, including all the formwork and glazing in China, all of the engineering disciplines and lighting and all of that. converge on these places, but they're not really of this place. But this place is not really of this place either. This is a rendering of the site of Business Bay, which was designed by the large engineering firm, British engineering firm Halcrow. And we, they're really a kind of colonial project, I would say, for Dubai. And then, of course, the radical development of the city, and the fact that it's really a series of free zones, each of which is branded in a very particular way, and then also very monofunctional in their use. The sort of reality of the site when we first visited. And then the realization that we really couldn't consider Dubai to be that unique. That in fact there are many cities that are developing this fast in various parts of the world, and I would argue are probably more similar than they are different. And how this model, and one could say that the tower is a kind of perfect kind of cosmopolitan architecture, develops in these places. I would want to say that I think contrary to certain critics who try to circumscribe Dubai and make it a kind of anomaly or the product of a very specific time and place, we would prefer to see it like a kind of battleground for architecture. I mean that, like in war, all of the kind of innovation and experimentation is simply heated up in situations like this. So these buildings, which are really not of the place, which become developed and then they're disseminated to other places. It's just that the circumstances allow for that kind of rapid invention. So we were inspired looking at essays about the buildings that, forerunners of the tower. The fantastic essay, which you probably all know, by Colin Rowe called Chicago Frame. And we were particularly taken not so much with the frame buildings he talks about, but the one anomalous project by Frank Lloyd Wright, which we thought in some sense had more possibilities for contemporary development. Of course, most of the towers in Dubai follow exactly the frame model. Of course, they're much more spectacular, they're more iconographically developed than the Chicago frame. But nevertheless, we were interested in trying to explore some other kind of dimension for the tower. So notionally, O14 is a kind of inverse of the tree structure and tray structure of the St. Mark's Tower. I was turning that inside out, making the trunk so big that the building fits inside it rather than sprouting slabs. And in fact, our first iterations kind of chart the movement from a frame structure. And we had a much more complex envelope, simplified it, at one point went through a kind of crisis, and then basically made the inversion, simplified it. So, in a way, and I don't know if one would really want to call the old models of modernism cosmopolitan, but nevertheless they had that kind of universal ambition. And we wanted to more or less kind of outline these avatars of the cosmopolitan. So post-book, I identified another figure, which is Magritte, a kind of commedia dell'arte, average European bourgeois, as being the sort of figure for modernism, the man without qualities, then the colonial, and then finally the new cosmopolitan. So, yeah, we'll just go through these. The Miesian avatar, the new colonial, who tries to become whatever the context is, but he brings a whole kind of technological equipment to those places. And then finally, a much more ambiguous type that doesn't really try to be like the context, but has context read into. And of course, that's also a function of the kinds of systems we're playing around with. One could argue that these sort of minor arts, basket weaving, is a really old kind of form of the cosmopolitan, where it kind of pops up in different places independently, and so it becomes by default a kind of universal model. Next was the issue of the effect of the building, our desire to produce a project that might look either smaller or larger than it really was, and so we were experimenting with a relatively simple building envelope, a kind of mass, and then a highly figured fenestration, and that became a very useful way of defeating any clear reading of height, in that the pattern that we were using, in contrast to a normative diagrid, doesn't correlate to floor heights, but actually is really basically indifferent to those heights. And then a whole series of consequences flow out of that relative to the interior. I won't talk about that. But there was kind of proof of concept in the blogs where people were trying to identify what was in the rendering, where it was, what height it was. So it does do its job. And then there were also kind of blind alleys. There was a moment when an early contractor who was finally thrown off the job suggested that we kind of move from a diagrid system to an orthogonal one, because he thought it was easier to build a building. But we thought it was a complete disaster in terms of all of the other ambitions we had about the project, because it merely reinforced this notion of scale rather than making it ambiguous, and it also didn't perform as a structure. It was a Vierendeal structure, which was really kind of heavy and inefficient as well. So luckily that was tossed out. And again, kind of looking back at kind of the process of design, going from initial renderings, which shows the building one way, to its most sort of material condition during construction, to kind of return to the rendered object when the building was finally finished. And then there's actually a fourth state with the building under dust, where you get a kind of materiality returning to the building, weeping building. But there are other kind of byproducts to the mass camouflage idea as well, in terms of the way the building is scanned in the oblique, either in the modernist version, or the modernist architecture, where the kind of perspectival vanishing point is one point, versus using multiple points of vanishing, and kind of destabilizing of observation. And then what those consequences are for the interior. So, the inlet steel buildings, metrics are very connected to the forms of organization and the storage of files, and of course the storage of people as well. And one of the kind of ambitions we had with the amorphic development of the shell, and also the patterning, was that there could be a new way of organizing the office space, kind of utopian idea. So this would be the old modernist model of the filing of people, and the hope that in future all of the partitions would go down with the miniaturization of everything and the elimination of paper files, and then there would be a much freer way of arranging and of being in the space. Anyway, over to issues of redundancy. I'm trying to go through this quickly. We compared the material condition of the tower of the World Trade Center, which was worked on by architect Yamasaki and Les Robertson. The two of them collaborated very closely on the kind of material makeup of the building, of really trying to maintain the absolute uniformity of the facades. But what that meant was that they actually had to have 14 alloys of steel in play of different strengths in order to kind of maintain that regularity. And what we find with 014, which we see as the kind of other end of the spectrum, is that we utilize the redundancy of the system, both in terms of the pattern and organization, but also the kind of material makeup. So we found that as we were designing the project, in order to keep the openness, the engineers had us keep increasing the capacity of the concrete. So almost kind of upping the strength of the concrete allowed the greatest heterogeneity of the project. So it was about one high strength rather than many differentiated strengths to produce geometrical performance. So the other part of this issue of performance came through the design process. There was a moment when, kind of lapsing back and probably into a more modernist desire, we wanted to use fair-faced concrete rather than paint. And so I had a train ride back from Princeton with Guy Nordenson. He was working on the MIT building with Stephen Hall, and he was arguing that, well, in order to kind of do fair-face in this condition, it has to be controlled, it should be precast. You can make moment connections between all the panels of the building, and it'll perform as an exoskeleton. But what I realized, and this really separates us from the engineers, I think, is that even though it might perform that way, it looks like applied panels to the building. And so we rejected that way of working and went for the paint instead. So again, another sort of byproduct of this idea of redundancy, has that the building has this capacity of working as a stack effect of cooling the building by actually 30%. And this led us to a speculation about sustainable buildings. And we realized that, in a sense, there probably and luckily is no architecture of sustainability. These are two projects by radically different architects, 41 Cooper Square by Orthosis, and then the George W. Bush Library by Bob Stern. Both of them have received LEED Platinum ratings. And so that was actually a tremendous relief to us, that we realized that it's really an architecture-free condition. You can produce many kinds of architecture, you can make them sustainable, but there really is no sustainable architecture unless you want to represent sustainability. If that's your mission, then it becomes a semiotic of the building, but it really has nothing to do with architecture per se. Okay, finally, I'll go through these quickly. There are parts of the project, and this is invested in, this is part of the book, is the reception side. So the book was, the project was very quickly kind of turned into a souvenir and became part of this family of iconic buildings, which are for sale. And there were many interpretations of the building. One of them Sanford made about bone, and I guess we were calling it an exoskeleton. He corrected us. It's not a skeleton at all. It's one piece of bone, which I think is true. But then, there were other readings as well that connected it to wastebasket, or some Russian bloggers said it was clearly indebted to Melnikov's house, which in retrospect, may be true, just in terms of how we went through the design process, quite similar, but it wasn't something that we had brought to consciousness at all. And then, of course, there are other interpretations as well. The other part of the project is a wider kind of obsession, I guess, an interest in holy projects, which range in scale from urban all the way down to interiors, and this has been going on for 15, almost 20 years. And then finally, to kind of close off the consequence part, that O14 had a life and a set of kind of possibilities, using the kind of exoskeleton shell. And when we got to the next kind of large project, a competition for the Shenzhen airport, we did quite literally think through the possibility of taking that tube structure, turning it on its side, doing one better with the fenestration instead of making cuts normal to it, that we would deal with variation of the cuts through the section. So I think that's also part of the way we work. It isn't so much program-based, but it's part of certain interests and obsessions that we try to find ways of then moving on to other projects, which may have a different scale and certainly would have a different program. So yeah, that closes my set of thoughts on the building, and I guess I'll hand over to Sylvia.
Asked to speak about history, and I guess I'll start off by saying I'll make this history short because you guys must be exhausted. I think that we lost. Am I okay? No. Promises. I said I would make it short. Did I turn it off? Sorry. Okay. We lost Mr. Kuma. So perhaps I can skip the preliminaries. This was supposed to be for him. So my story was going to start with a story about having taken a group of students. We were chasing down a book published in 1964, Architecture Without Architects. And this chase led us to, of all places, Syracuse, Sicily, which is not where most young architects expect them to find themselves. And as we were walking down a small street in this Greco-Roman town, out of the corner of my eye, I saw this, which I really did not expect to find there, which was a twist-tied, plastic, laser-cut, proto-fabricated, blah, 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 by Kengo Kuma and his students. Let me say that there is no real history that I could give you that would properly link Japan, the United States, and this Greco-Roman city. We're all too moving around for that kind of thing, and I guess the simple thing that I would have to say is that the weaker these kinds of historical forces become, the more important it becomes to think about how you're going to put the facts together loosely, how to make them credible. So in honor of your principle, I would say that increasingly history has become a question of curating facts that actually are facts, but have nothing to do with one another at all. So another way to describe that is to think of history as a black box, which is to say it's not known, it's not interesting because of the truth that it reveals, but instead it's important because of the effects that it might produce, and that you only really know it by looking at these effects. So this, for me, this view of history is quite different than the one that we normally are asked to think about, which is to say that we think of history as a white box, as an open book, to continue Brett's discussion, and to think about it unfolding in a logical way that explains essentially how the present derives from the past. And in this sense, I would say that the way we normally think of history is actually analogous to, is intended in some ways to reinforce the way we think of design as unfolding in this kind of logic. A logic that we see not being transformed, but actually reproduced and reinforced by the new computational tools that most of you all use. So this all would then get me back to the box, and the box as a primitive. My own interest would be in loosening up history from facts, and I would do it by planting, in effect, false primitives at the beginning to see what they could do. Now, so every story then will have two stories. It will have multiple truths, one truth that is the open book, and the other one that is the closed one. This is the story of Eisenman that you know. This is, you know, where it goes. And I will show you this one instead. So this is House 1 in Princeton, built in Princeton. This is also House 1, also built in Princeton. This is a drawing by the contractor telling Peter to get the stair out of the fireplace. Now, I could tell you another story. Lots of Princeton students are here. Hello, guys. Good to see you around here. This is a Princeton connection. I'm talking about a project at Princeton, actually that has nothing to do with it because, of course, the other thing that history is a conversation, and I picked this one just because it's an image that Jeff loves, and he wants to steal it from me, so I thought I would just offer it gratis here. But in having had this conversation with Jeff many times about whether I was going to give him this image or not, to use to construct whatever histories he wanted to construct, I started thinking, you know, there's an incredible thing. There's an incredible story about architects who can't get the damn fireplace out of the stairs. This would probably be a really well-known one. So when you start looking at the plan, there's a real problem in the relationship between the stairs and the fireplace. And in fact, poor Bob Venturi never had the proper contractor to tell him to get the stair out of the fireplace. So there is a whole alternative history, let's say, a double set of books. There's the one set of books about meaning and signification and dematerialization, etc. And there's another set of books that would tell us something about the negotiation between the professional demands on the one hand of architecture and the disciplinary demands on the other. And to think of those two sets of terms as ones that never properly go together, but serve different historical purposes, I would say. So, to try to make this brief, I was thinking, well, what other kinds of primitives that could we throw in to make Jeff happy? And this is another one, completely unrelated to the first one. This is a project that the Harrisons did in LA in the 1970s, and it's a shrimp farm. These are, essentially, they look like rice paddies, except that they're growing shrimp, and growing shrimp to eat. So this is an art project about transforming the ground of the museum, which is to say the abstract ground of the cosmopolitan world, to return it to a kind of false, invented forms of service and utility. I think this is an incredible transformation of, say, color field painting, in which the thickness of the visible surface is moved onto the ground. In other words, this painting is rendered architectural in some way by turning it back to the ground, and that ground is examined for ways of making it productive. So most of us think about our primitives and our present in terms of the denaturalization of the ground, the abstraction of the ground, but in fact there's an alternative history to that same ground that sees ways of essentially reseeding it with new forms of fertility. If we think about using the pictorial surface to reseed the ground, we think about Walter Benjamin's arguments. He argued that nature had been replaced by industry. We might now say that industry has been replaced by junk space, and that trying to figure out how to make junk space itself a productive ground might be one of the things that architecture could do today. So my third primitive would be, is this one, which is another example of somebody trying to negotiate the problems of material life against an abstract ground. This is, believe it or not, a project from the late 1930s by an Italian architect for a house of fascism. And fascism is here produced by local cheese. And you can imagine, you can see I'm getting to 014 because I got the holes going now. Pardon me, fascism? No, it was really just the holes. And reminding you that when you get a chunk of cheese, it starts to sag in the heat. So the cheese has a material behavior. It kind of gets droopy and thick around the middle in a way that the ground, in fact, does not move. So by substituting cheese for building material, you get a reverse of the typical view of the relationship between building and ground, which is to say that the ground might have a kind of natural life cycle, but the building is inert. And here you have this completely transformed. So, okay, so we could do the whole thing. We could have a competition. How many buildings with how many holes could we find? But I was thinking about something slightly different, which is to say that the hole is not really exactly a hole, and how does the material life and other kinds of flows come together. And I started thinking about this set of dishes, where you see at the top, you've got a nice, perfect circular hole, and by the time you get to the bottom, something funky has begun to happen to it. It's not exactly a squircle, but it's getting close. Here is a detail. And this is a set of dishes made by Joe Colombo for Alitalia, in which the geometry of the ideal plate, let's say, is severed and squished by the economic reality of the size of an airplane tray that has to fit everything in it compactly. So here you see geometry working through, on the one hand, the forces of matter and geometry, and on the other hand, the forces of economics, trying to figure out how those things might get negotiated. So when I think back at my false primitives, I think about the construction of the ways architecture deals with negotiating the relationship between disciplinary and professional practices, the way architecture has to negotiate and essentially invent a new kind of fertility to the ground, and the way we think today about the relationship between material and economic forces. And each one of those things seems to me paradigmatic points of departure for any architectural project. Now, to just switch gears very, very, very briefly, and then I'm just going to end because we're sort of out of time. I did want to play with Jesse in a kind of whole problem and think about what a different, let's say, etiology of the whole might produce. And was really interested in the Smithson essay on A City Full of Holes, which I think has absolutely nothing to do with 014, except in my very, overly active imagination. One of the things that I started to understand is that this city full of holes takes us very quickly to the Middle East. All of a sudden, Dubai started to not be very far away. There were lots of architects after the Second World War, modernist architects building over there, including the Smithsons, who designed a project organized around a series of holes in Kuwait City, although of course Kuwait City was then a hole having been raised. And the thing that they drew as holes were actually the solid minarets that were still standing. So they have their own relationship to holes, and the kind of exoticism that Jesse was describing about finding Dubai as a site actually turns out to be overdetermined in some place as a site already scripted with the problem of the hole and the void. And more specifically, when they designed a building of holes like this one, what they in fact produced was a mat building, and I just hadn't realized it before that the mat building is an Arab city. That's exactly what it's modeled after. So their sense of the exotic is actually really a sense of the parochial, local vernacular. So we might think of one of the ways that this building is conceived is as an extruded mat building, having certain kinds of features that are related. The thing that I will sort of make my finishing remarks on has to do with the name that Alison Smithson gave this essay, which is How to Recognize and Read a Mat Building. So I'd like to end with this question of legibility and whether or not this is a building that we would want to read, and whether reading is the skill that we need in order to understand architecture and its own effects in the world. So, of course, Jesse can tell you about its relationship to towers and so forth. The one thing that I would want to link it to is the problem of entasis, not only because the building could said to be fluted, but because entasis is one of the great architectural kind of shell games. It's one of the great cons of architecture, which is to say it's one of the most important features of Greek architecture that was completely neglected, overlooked, undrawn, and unconsidered, unknown until the early part of the 20th century. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary that you could have that many columns behaving like big pieces of cheese, stinking and stretching around the middle, and have absolutely nobody notice them. So for me, the relationship of the building to entasis really calls into question what it means to read a building, because all of those columns were doing a lot of work, even if we didn't know that the entasis was there. So I prefer to think of the building in terms of misreading, in terms of the things that it makes it difficult to see. We could spend a while thinking about what the windows make you think that you're seeing that you're not, the patterns that you want to read in the fall of the holes, but really probably you better not, the way it tries to make sense of the landscape, but a landscape that it doesn't think has anything to say, at least that's the way I understood you to describe it, the way it deals with the denaturalization of the landscape rather than its reinforcement, the windows that it frames, and so forth. So now I'll conclude by saying if you think about the history of holes in architecture and think about them as a kind of material property of building, you start to see exactly a development away from the function of the hole to its legibility. So the Pantheon is the famous hole, and it looks like a hole, and it's a circle, and the building is a circle. You have everything lining up in a perfect kind of unity. But that hole in the dome of the Pantheon turned into a lantern. I mean, a lantern on the top of the dome is a three-dimensional hole. That's exactly what it is. And its function is to negotiate the relationship between the interior climate and the exterior climate in terms of light and air. If you start studying the history of domes, what you start to discover is yet another shell game, where you have the exterior profile of the dome and the interior profile of the dome beginning to separate increasingly radically, producing two completely divorced your systems of legibility, they don't line up at all. They produce an entire pictorial vocabulary of the treatment, particularly of the interior dome, to exaggerate rather than make those kinds of conditions coalesce, until finally you can end up in the weather climates of the day and start realizing that this notion of lining things up is really a historical fantasy rather than a historical fact. So I think of 014 as as an excuse to produce history that ends in the argument that buildings today are kind of microclimates, if you will. So that was. I will end with my own 4 points. So first of all, architects get the fireplace out of the staircase, which would be to say to historians, get the facts out of your history. Second point, make the ground productive, which is to say, to consider what the ground of history is. And maybe we could continue this conversation, Brett, trying to think about books, which you presented as, in effect, the ground on which ideas grow. We might turn that into the question of how ideas are shaped today, because I think people have argued that the book is a part of a culture of the past. And we might, I was very impressed by the consistency of the book in some way in your presentation. And we might think about new books today and how those shape the kinds of ideas that we might have. And finally, to architects, please make good weather. Just the way I would say to historians and theorists, please make a good conversation. And I think that your whole project is about facilitating conversation, and I wish you the best of luck. Thank you.
So while they're setting up, you are completely welcome to leave. I'm the laziest person on this panel, and it's my professional desire to have as much free time as I possibly can have. I would never do the work that picture of Brett sitting there reading all that crap. I know those second-rate writers that can't actually get from a capital letter to a period, and trying to correct that stuff. It was like, that was the horror story of my life, even though it's him and his type that give me all the money and all that sort of stuff. I would never build a building. If you see all that work and all that headache and all the lawsuits, kind of like, these guys are in their office real hours. I sort of like the historian model. Unfortunately, you have to go places and look stuff up and have facts and stuff like that. So, and I realize that the real power in the world is the critic. And so what I'm going to be I'll be very briefly, and by the way, I'm not going to talk about 014 at all. I have one 014 joke, and then that's it. You can't read my essay in the book, which is the longest essay in the book. But come on a second, pay by the word. So let's just quickly, what I do is sort of what Sylvia does, except complete BS, just not based on any facts at all. It's based on magic tricks. It's a curatorial idea. So do you want me to paddle back? Is this good enough? Can you hear me? Okay. So this is a really famous building. You know this building? It's pretty good. This is another famous building. It is pretty good. And like journalist criticism, if you read about these buildings in the newspaper, it would talk about this building as if it was by itself and never connected. But this act is the act of a critic, which is a curatorial act. Take two things together and then build an argument about them. Now, it could have been, by the time, let's say, Ken Frampton is writing the comparison of these two buildings in the late 1970s, he probably had 200 legitimate glass houses he could have chosen. But he actually had an argument he wanted to make, and so he needed to put these two things together, and he caused them to be the dialectic polarizations of his argument, and he used those to produce what was important at the time for a critic, which was one that was good and one that was evil. And it turns out that the one that's white is good and the one that's black is evil. And it doesn't hold up to scrutiny, and it never will hold up to scrutiny, and it's a magic trick, and it is the magic trick of criticism, but I love it, and it actually mobilizes in the short term the discipline as much as a project. So even though I am the worst kind of parasite on the 3 kinds of people that you just heard who actually do the real work, I'm the person I think you should envy the most, highest paid, least working, and for a very short period of time, the biggest impact on the field. 3 years ago, I was here. Kengo Kuma presented this project, which I was actually thrilled to see. Thought it was a fantastic project, and couldn't believe when I got back 3 years later it was built. When he presented the project, as you know, when Jesse presents a project or Kengo presents the project, the amount of thinking architects do about their work, they are not exceptions. I mean, even lesser architects in my mind, they think, they keep building arguments, and exactly like Jesse said, they not only keep building arguments before, during, but continue to build them after. And it just goes on and on and on, because that's how they keep working. So he presented this, of course, exactly like you would expect it to. It's a reflection on the importance of this important temple, what's it called, the Senjo Temple, and so, you know, which is with this wonderful pagoda, and so you kind of immediately see that it's taking out the pagoda, so it's contextual. And then, of course, there's this wonderful street, I forgot the name of it, I memorized these things a minute ago, Nakamisi Dori. Yeah, pretty good. See, that was the work I did for this lecture. And you know, he explains that, and you see, it's that plus that equals that. And I don't think my job is to repeat what the architect says or explain what the architect says. My job is to do exactly what it says, to curate bullshit and make it, and make you actually like my story better than their stories. So, you know, I went to see it today, and it was really an impressive building. It's actually, I think, a very important work of architecture for reasons that I think are theoretically critical. I read one essay which talked about it in the same terms as the sky tree in architectural record. And the sky tree may be the tallest building in the world, but it's an irrelevant piece of architecture. It doesn't do any new architectural work. It doesn't do engineering work. It's kind of grotesque. I hope they plant something on it, make it green. So this is it. You know, now how do you think about this? So how do I think? The way I think about this is the only way I can think about anything is I start to match it up with other stuff. I try to figure out what's its discussion. Is it in the discussion with the single surface projects? Is it in discussion, you know, remember this is the most expensive house ever built in the world by Perkins and Wills in India. I forgot the name of it. It's pretty awful. All this is to make this other building. You know, then I think of FOA, they're starting, so the single surface project, 2 things are going on now. There's the single surface, history of recent single surface projects, history of single surface becoming stacks, and then history of single surfaces starting to take on a figural language. And then, so you can see that. And then all of a sudden, the figural language in the pile, stacks and piles, from Beecher comes in. And so now I own this building. So when you see this building, you will see, for example, you see the little house there, you see it right there in the middle. So it is a single surface building and a combination of piles with a figural relationship to semiotics or context or meaning that does completely new kind of architectural work. The thing I think is so interesting about this building is it works contextually, it works in terms of the disorganization and instability of structure. And so it has a profound ability in architecture to set a lot of possibilities in motion, even though it's, you know, it's not going to be an iconic building that tourists are going to visit. So for me in architecture, just the ability to make these kinds of comparisons and have the comparisons have no meaning sets into motion, like I invent, or a critic invents, the single surface project by seeing 4 spontaneous projects that seem similar in terms of single surface. and then all of a sudden the single surface problem we're able to become discriminated. We know mannerisms in it, we know the details of it, we know the horizontal extrusions of it. I can start to tell the difference between when it's too figural or not, the horizontal extrusion in the window. So it sets in motion in the discipline for a very short period of time, a very powerful effect, whose most important value is that it also dissipates that quickly. So let me just show you real quickly the one thing. So my entire essay in the book is based on a comparison of these two buildings. And I was a year late before I even started on that essay. And I'm sitting around, this is really, I know you're going to think I'm lying to you, but this is absolutely the truth. This is an essay. Before I go to reviews at any school, I pick up something like this, structural developments of tall buildings, current trends, and then I pick out a few phrases that I can say on a review so I sound like moment frame. You need more moment frames. Or, as we know, so I just pick a few lines I can say on a review so I sound like that. Actually, you know what I'm talking about. And I'm, thumbing through this thing. This is actually really what happened. I'm looking at this. Anyway, the reason I don't know how to write this essay on 014 is I can't think of a building to compare it to. I just don't really know what to do. So I'm a year late. I'm going through this thing, and as I go through this thing, like a cup of coffee in the morning, just walk my dogs, just play the piano for 3 hours, just cut class, just actually cancel class because I just didn't feel like going. And then I just run across this picture. And there it is. There's my essay. And my work was done for the day. And that would be it. Thank you. My theme is curate and BS. That's the real job of criticism. I do think it's fantastic that Yusuke and Kengo have decided to add a media initiative to the question of the sustainable prototype, because you will never become, without that kind of comparative knowledge and the sort of hysterical attention to small details that this sort of body of work brings to it, the kind of way you can think about a building in terms of its precision and very small issues, how it meets the ground, how it meets the sky, the status of the sky, how the door ended. I mean, every time that I see that door at 014, I feel like killing myself. It's a really terrible work. But, well, my hands are falling. That's one thing I'm ready to lose a lot of weight. That's it.
So we'll continue in form of discussion. The original plan was to have a quick break, but I think it's better to just go through right now. I think we're running a bit late. So all the participants, including Nanako, joining forward with the discussion.
So we'll stick with them for the discussion. I thought, as I was listening to the presentations, I thought maybe one way to start would be maybe we just think of an idea or two that clearly spans across each of the presentations in addition to the project under discussion. And I think one such term would be, and it links I think directly to your interest in the symposium, the question of audience. One way to distinguish both the different arguments and the different vantages take on the project is in a way that each of you are framing your work in relation to a slightly different kind of audience than the others. And in fact, to distinguish Nanako and Jesse's, what I would call critical project from just buildings in the sand, one way to do that would be to say these are architects pursuing their work with an idea of an audience beyond their own set of projects and career. and clearly thinking about how that relates. Same could be made of the question of the critic. The critic speaks, in addition to the work the critic is doing, is speaking to a different kind of audience than those that necessarily an architect or a historian might be speaking to. The late modern history of criticism certainly is the evolution of very different kinds of audiences than were a part of architectural discussion in the past, thinking of the role of newspapers and other settings. History also inevitably begs questions about how particular historical projects or someone, if they want to use the word methods, suggest that they're speaking to other historians in ways that historians within a field might not be. And there's a very intimate kind of relationship. And I'm just wondering if in the work each of you do, if you might say something about the question of audience on your own terms. And if you are, in fact, as you do your work the way you do it, thinking of someone beyond either the other people at this panel, and I know there's a lot of that kind of conversation going also, but beyond that. Maybe Sylvia, since you're on this side, you want to start, and we'll just run across.
Gosh. Well, I think I'm going to answer that question maybe a little bit differently than you asked it, because you're asking about how I think of my audience. I'm sure the very simple answer to that is not enough. That's really all I have to say about that. But I was thinking instead about the notion of a monograph. Because one of the things that I thought was interesting that came out in thinking about your presentation and the book was a certain tension, if you will, between the book that is a monograph and the emphasis that you both placed on the notion of serial production. So if the building isn't a singular thing, the monograph is a slightly has a problematic relationship to the notion of seriality. And I was thinking then back about Core, who played such an important role in what the history of all of these architectural books are that you mentioned, and how recent, in fact, the monograph on a single building is. That cannot be written deep into the history of architecture. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. And I would go farther to say, Pache, everybody, that it comes to be needed in relation to the history of the need to promote architectural practices in a certain way. So the monograph is fundamentally a promotional advertising branding term, or it has been, which is slightly different than the kind of idea-driven book. Now, I'm not saying that's all that it is, don't take me wrong, but I am saying that I think that for me, that would be an opportunity to actually unfold and make a negotiated difference between a kind of intellectual disciplinary practice and a professional practice, and to think about the different kinds of books and platforms that we might use in order to deal with those kinds of things.
Well, I think the book for us was more a kind of tool. The audience wasn't an abstract audience. It was actually, for us, probably a very small audience that, you do the project not for the public in general, but for that small number of people who are in the discipline who might have something to say relative to the project. So I guess that's especially true with an AA book where there's almost no distribution. It's got a very special audience and a group of people around it who are thinking on architecture. So I don't know, for us, and certainly for me, it's an opportunity to kind of move out of the solipsism of working on the project and of getting very, very precise feedback. I mean, that's how we structured this monograph. I don't think it's the normative monograph, in the sense of...
Don't take me wrong. I mean, I'm just saying that I think that everybody, I think that I take Brett's question very seriously in the context of a media, this kind of thing that we're talking about, which is to say, why not construct more than one kind of audience? So the book is not just talking to a small number of people, because that's a conversation you have on a jury.
Right.
You know, it's a different kind of conversation, and the AA is producing an audience of a certain kind, and it's framed in a particular way. That's all, you know. So
Yeah.
then you have the mass audience, you have the intimate audience, you have the professional audience. I don't think they have to line up, and I just wanted to put the book on the table.
Sure.
And say it's an audience building. It plays, in addition to all of these other roles, it plays the role of building a constituency of a certain kind
Right.
for your practice.
No, that's true. I mean, you know, even within the book, there were more reception was built into the structure of the book. And some of them were more like soundings that went out, and you got reactions back from the media, and we tried to kind of incorporate some of that, you know, as a way of understanding what the effects of the building were. But then the other part of it were, you know, I guess was more the expert audience, you know, you guys, you know, around the project, as a way of advancing an overall project. Not to kind of close this thing off at that building, but that it becomes incredibly useful to us, you know, to get those reactions and to, you know, see the book again, not as a kind of an ossified moment in the project, or after you completed a project, it becomes a way of motivating, you know, an overall project, advancing what we were working on.
I know my audience absolutely perfectly. It's the architect I just wrote about, and the 16 students I just ordered to read it. And that's it. Those are the 17 people that are my audience, and that's exactly the audience I want. I want only, their journalist critics do a very good job at working as intermediaries between the expert discourse and the public. I'm interested in mobilizing the discussion among expert disciplines, because the thing about a critic is we don't really have theories, but we have agendas. We have definitely a way that we want to affect things, and so our magic tricks are about causing that to happen without polemicizing it. And so you can see it all. For example, I think Ken Francis' desire to produce a synthesis between Heideggerian discourse and Marxist discourse drives all of his criticism, because he sees architecture as the place where these two, for him, very fundamental ways of thinking about a true life in the world is executed. Never says that, never writes that down, but causes that to happen in his comparisons. And I feel the same. I always know, having seen what I see, and see relationships between what I see, what I want to see next. So I'm basically inviting it. But the other thing is, originality. Einstein didn't think of the theory of relativity. He was the person in a community of 19 people who that thought finally hit first. So the idea that you're always in a community, originality, like if you Google it, if you have an idea and you think it's a great idea, and you Google it and nothing shows up, it's a bad idea. It's not an original idea, it's just a bad idea. If you Google it and lots of stuff shows up, even exactly the same title, but it's not quite what you were thinking, it's real close to what you were thinking, it's not quite, then you're onto something really big and really important. And that only happens if there's a kind of exchange set up between the publisher, the critic, and the historian. I mean, it has to be an economy of ideas, and it has to have different speeds. The speed of history, the speed of publication, the speed of the work, and the speed of the discussion. And so I'm lucky enough to have very precise, and I don't depend on numbers. I don't depend on 19 million readers.
I've thought about it an awful lot, let's say from the publisher side compared to the editor, and I think one of the things that strikes me in that view, and I think that's a view, Jeff, that many of us would share, that in fact finding compatriots, compadres, conspirators in the project is enough of a project right now. What I play that against, though, are certain fields, certain disciplines, in fact, where there's an expectation that the expert conversation can be embodied in the same figure that's also speaking quite broadly, i.e. not handing that task over to a journalist or someone else, an intermediary, And the model I would think of is something like, let's take Nobel Prize winning economists writing highly technical papers that 12 other economists can understand, and on the same hand, having an expectation that they can write best-selling explanations of those theories, like a Paul Krugman, like Stiglitz, like others, and that in fact, rather than an ecology where all of those tasks spread out into different bodies, there's still the possibility. And architecture has certainly had this moment at times in its, let's say in the last 100 years when it operated that way. It's very different, it seems, than where we are right now with architecture. And I would think we're kind of going towards the proliferation of different figures. And it's an interesting one, but it's not a natural assumption. It's simply one that we're constructing in our own.
I think you were saying something important, though, because whether it's Kaufman or any of the people you're talking about, or Jesse, quickly the originator of the work, the scientist or the architect, starts to absorb all of the techniques of discussion into their own. Like Jesse's presentation of his own building and his own thinking of building would be inconceivable 20 years ago. So it has already absorbed the techniques of criticism and of history and discussion, and now it becomes part of his process, and so we step outside of that. So you would never have read, even when Einstein wrote, or any great physicist before Kaufman, wrote popularizations, they were reductions, they were not gifted commentary. So, you know, it's true. I mean, I just think when Tchaikovsky wrote the B-flat minor piano concerto, only 3 pianists could play it. In fact, it was condemned as being irrelevant musically because there are only 3 people in the world that can play it. You can't graduate from a third-rate piano conservatory today without playing it. And the reason for that is it's been turned into pedagogy. You know, genius has been turned into pedagogy to produce mediocrity, so new genius can grow out of that. So I actually think my job is to increase the world's level of mediocrity by turning it into pedagogy. So I don't know. I think you have to trust all of the features of the ecology, you know, which is you have to trust it all, and you have to understand. You have to stay out of trying to globally comprehend it. I think those are the 2 big mistakes you guys make.
What you touch on the answer about the pedagogy is, of course, another A word that you could say that the different species here share, which is the idea of the academy being somehow an important kind of space for this sort of work to go on. And, you know, which comes back to the let's say the broader theme right now, and the question of the laboratories that you're setting up here, and the relationship of those spaces, not just to one another, but potentially beyond the setting of the university to either a larger culture of architecture here in Japan, or maybe some broader definition of the dissemination of knowledge. And I think, I'm just wondering if you know, we are in a world in which what we think of as the academy is hardening its borders, and there could be an argument made both for that possibility and its necessity today in order for the advancement of ideas and the further, or in fact it is a kind of relentless force of those boundaries now being broken down and a kind of constant dissipation of collaborative, interactive environments, working knowledge. And I'm just wondering from your different experiences, if you, just as Jesse and Nanako have written about, you know, a kind of vital need for there to remain a difference between engineering and architecture, if there are real differences in, let's say, your experience and work in the academy or at school versus the work you do back at the studio.
Do you want me to just?
Yeah.
Well, let me words down. Do I need to? Is that better? I'm not even sure what the academy is anymore. I mean, leaving aside whether or not we want to defend it. And I think this is a little bit what I meant about the monograph also, and the kind of role that it plays. I mean, there used to be like a profound separation parallel to the separation of church and state, of certain kinds of economy from the flow of ideas in the university. I mean, that's what academic freedom was about. That was what tenure was about. I mean, there was a notion of the university being protected, the academy being protected. It simply doesn't work that way anymore. And you know, every single day it works less and less that way. And if academics don't begin to understand the fundamental challenges to academic culture that the flows of contemporary economy are producing, we won't have the space to talk to 16 people. I mean, so if you can't talk to 16 people and 1,600 people and 16,000 people, you're probably going to end up talking to nobody. And so now, I'm not sure exactly where to stand in that. I mean, on some level, I would defend to the death the right and importance and the need to talk only to 16 people. But at the same time, it just, it's a kind of a naive attachment even to the sort of the purity of ideas, that they don't flow along with everything else through sewers and through the atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, on some level, I think it's important to be aggressive and to say that the purpose of a lot of these publications is they have an economic purpose. And we are a little bit more adept at understanding that those economic purposes are related to professional practices, because we can talk about professional practices as related to economies without gagging exactly. We have an entire apparatus for separating the discipline, which is economy free, from the profession, which is economy rich. And that distinction may need to be preserved, but it's not a distinction that we can hold as absolute, just as we can't maintain the distinction between the economy and those publics. And I do not think that journalists do a good job of negotiating that. I think journalists ridicule that at the expense of the academic. I mean, I think the journalist is the evilest of them all in this, if you want to go ethical. And the reason that they're able to do that is that, frankly, we don't do it enough. I mean, we don't deal with those kinds of issues enough. I'm done. I don't really have anything else to say.
That was good, like,
Yeah, I'm done.
we just,
I was asking the two of you the question in a way because the practitioner, of course, is that figure that makes a kind of daily calculation as someone who's working usually under tremendous pressure. Every minute of the day is, particularly in a city like New York, billable, and if you're working on a project with a developer in Dubai, I can imagine there's a calculation that's more intimate than an academic or someone employed by a major research university would have to negotiate those forces. As the two of you have committed for 25 years to that being a vital part of your lives, just to say something briefly about that and what it does contribute to the kind of work that we're seeing, or detract from the kind of work you're seeing in the presentation this evening.
Well, our case, I think maybe, how do you say that, we didn't really separate our practice from teaching. So therefore we suffered a lot financially. But everything we experimented in our office also we applied to the teaching, and also we learned from teaching too. So for many years we didn't really have a separation. But now we began to build so that we, in some way, that we really had to think about the economy. But we still are sort of, I do think.
Think of Peter still sitting in the empty office.
yeah, and if you don't want to be a service practice, if you want to be a culturally driven practice, you're just trying to fend off bankruptcy. That's just, you spend your whole life trying to fend off bankruptcy. I mean, and then you'll have rich periods and poor periods. If you want to be a service practice, by the way, service practice is a really fantastic thing to be. I keep telling everybody, if you go to a dentist, you don't want a decon dentist, a pomo dentist, then you want a service dentist. But you also want there to be, there's an area of dental experimentation going on some poor guy's teeth or some dog's teeth. At least when our experiments fail, no one's in agony or dies. They just don't like it.
But I mean, what if one said? What if one said that the disciplinary practice actually had every intention of becoming a service practice? It just failed. I mean, just a bad service practice. I mean, let's just say hypothetically.
I think that's just, Nietzsche decided he wanted to make some money finally on one of his books. And so he wrote Zarathustra. And instead of publishing it with his publisher, he self-published it. So because he was going to get rich on it, he sold 4 copies. So intending to be a service practice doesn't really, to be a service practice isn't to be a compromising, bad, boutique, culturally driven practice. It's to be really good at service because it's its own form of genius. So I just don't think they cross over. You know, I just don't think you choose. You end up going where you are going to be. I do, like, there are early adopters. There are people in the practice who adapt, the better. Like Harry, I mean, just about everybody at Harvard is basically, all the stuff that comes out of that work has been developed by other people, and then it's cherry-picked for what works best and without any ideological baggage in a commercial practice, and it works really well, and actually it's probably the most important part of the discourse. You know, I mean, you don't want to be, you want to be the Bakey, you want to be the guy who did the first successful heart transplant. You don't want to be the 80 doctors before that, all of whom had their patients die. You know, so the early adopting model is an important part of our discipline. You know, so there's a range between service practices and experimental practices. I hate the word experimental practices because, as far as I know, no architect that has an experimental practice ever goes back and finds out the results of the experiment. They just say every experiment is a success, and then they don't go visit again. But you know, I think I think you have to have a model in your mind about what is your effect in the world. Like, you know, when I listen, you have to have a model of your agency, and then you have to have the goal comes from that, and then everything else is driven by that. I think it would be ridiculous to think that the standard thought is that critics are the parasite of, or historic, you know, basically the artists are the ones that do the production, and that's all that necessarily is the case. And nothing could be, I don't know, so wrong as to be so obviously ignorant as to have that thought, as to have no one commenting on it. Like when you go to a movie, the first thing you want to do when you walk out of a movie is talk about the movie. And frankly, it's the talking about the movie that sells tickets, not the movie. So it's the talking about the stuff that actually is the goal of it. Actually, you know, you said a lot of things that were right, and you said a lot of things that were wrong. I think it's, you know, the books, a lot of books that I see get bought in architecture are bought more like the ones with the untorn sleeves. You know? So somehow for me it's the conversation, it's what you actually are trying to produce is the hysterical attention to ridiculously small details that comes from, you know, if you go to a movie and you're enthusiastic about the movie, you'll know every line from it, you'll know every scene, you'll know the relationship between it and other films like that, and that's what is energizing. And I also think, I also believe, when you ask a question in the audience, I also start to think each medium, let me put this in a different way. One of the things I think is really weird about architecture when I first got in here, I changed my model as a theorist critic from correcting what I thought were flaws into accepting the idea that what's there is working well, and that my problem is I have a naive notion of flaws. So in science, or in most disciplines, law, you will footnote your references. And it's important. It's actually crucial to the development of science. You will never see any architect ever refer to anybody else at the same time doing similar work. Jesse showed movies, history, you know, showed everything all over the place, but the only contemporary architect he mentioned at all was Hani, his classmate, in order to trash it. So when I first got as immaterial and irrelevant, wasn't it? So I first thought, okay, you know, I'm going to make students footnote work and describe the problem, and then I realized that there's something wrong with that. That what's working is working, and there is a knowledge, there is complete acknowledgement of it. The acknowledgement's in the work. You don't have to say, you know, I'm doing a single surface problem, and I have added this to it. So changing each discipline and each practice has its own model of productivity. I've heard people say, for example, that fashion doesn't have a theoretical discourse. But if you say something like, if you go to a fashion designer and you say, this year, sophistication is in, it will sound like a journalistic metaphor to us, but it will mean a precise set of cuts and stitches and choices of materiality. It will be instrumentally theoretical to that audience. And so I am definitely for the closed disciplinary discourse model, and I am definitely for the hysterical exaggeration of small details, and that's it. So it's with a project.
But that would be an interesting.
Look how dumb this is. Sunday night. 9 hours into a day. This is how dumb even the sponsors left. I mean, they're usually there to make sure they get their money's worth. So.
That would be an interesting segue into the issue of the situation here also, because I mean, there's sort of an assumption that there hasn't been theory in Japan for so long.
Yeah, I think that's wrong.
Yeah. So, yeah.
It just hasn't sounded like theory in the U.S. and England. Well, England is a good place, but anyway, yeah, it doesn't sound like what we would sound of theory. You know it's true because innovation in architecture has occurred here that is really important.
But it's also, it's not just that the absence of theory and a discursive, sound, which it may be, but also it's because they don't carry the association of the divorce between professional practice and disciplinary practice with the theoretical position. So that's not a kind of point of rupture that needs to be recuperated again and again and again in the theoretical text. So that, I mean, if we're going to get particular, I would say that that's a very particular thing, and there's a whole other question of different kinds of audiences and different kinds of production. I mean, I think that that's exactly parallel to the conversation that we were having about the building today, that it can be particular and anonymous at the same time, and is not using the project to overcome a sense of guilt and transgression in making those two things isomorphic with one another. I mean, when I said that the monograph was an instrument of branding for the office, I could feel my good friends Jesse and Nanako, like their heart sinking as though I were saying something aggressive and demeaning to them. Whereas I'm just trying to get all of these things to talk to each other, to say that we all have to do that all the time, and somehow we, the theory, nation state, has an incredible anxiety about that as a form of transgression. And I think it's incredibly, I won't say good, but I think it's super interesting to think of a non-troubled model about that. Just to say, maybe, just the way you are doing, I think, with China, in the constant, instant, guilt-free, legally and otherwise, guilt-free replication of work that would be copyrighted elsewhere. And for me, I think it's an incredibly interesting thing, and it goes back to specific the work, because when the difference between the Mona Lisa and the copy of the Mona Lisa, one of the things that was the most surprising to me about 014, given what I know about the prehistory of your work, from way back when, all of those collages, and I mean this kind of like spit and glue, and like you can smell every ingredient in those things. The last thing I imagined was that the final building would look like a rendering of all of the people that I knew. That it would be conceivable that you would produce a building that to this day, I look at pictures and I cannot tell whether I'm looking at a goddamn rendering or a photograph. So in the thing, there is a logic of its replication. You beat China to the punch, right? I mean, the building is already copying itself at infinitum without any anxiety, and almost with a kind of hubris. And it makes me think, maybe we've had this conversation, Frank Gehry has a very technically worked out lecture style where he starts off with a drawing, a sketch, that looks like nothing. I mean, you can't distinguish it from any other project. It looks like a bunch of lines. And then he spends an hour and a half showing you the doodle-a-doodle-a-doo and CATIA and the more CATIA, construction, and an hour and a half later, you get the finished building. And the very last slide is the original sketch and the finished building. And the point is to say, voila, look how because all of a sudden they look exactly the same. Except they don't look anything alike. I mean, you can recognize them, but one is a doodle, and one is like a sparkly titanium whatever. Yours actually look alike.
I tell you, the funny thing
So
is, it's post-photograph Photoshop. Because when you go there, actually,
No, I
the
understand.
funny thing about that building
But
is
not
when
in
you
a book.
visit it, it's dusty. It looks like the first building ever built in Dubai. 40 years, like it was built 40 years ago.
Right, but not in the book.
No, I just.
Not in the book. So the book does a certain kind of work, and the work is a replication machine. And I mean, and that's part of what's interesting.
It's interesting also though, because it touches on the point Jeff was just making a minute ago about Nanako Jesse's kind of command of the argument, and what is being presented isn't a project, but an argument about a project. And in a way, that's also what's quite interesting across the presentations, is what you're seeing is the forms that argument takes today. And to first realize that argument is a form that evolves and changes like any other form in the world. It isn't a fixed, stable thing. In fact, it would be a very interesting history of architecture to look at the different arguments, the form of the arguments that architects have long invoked and how radically they do change. But one of the points of an argument is that it's in effect a piece of technology. It is designed to accomplish a purpose. One of the purposes is the comprehension of a thing that's, even for the people that are involved, very difficult sometimes to follow. And I think it begs questions about the technological bias of the particular kind of argument being made today, i.e. it's not an argument made as if a computer, but it's a very carefully, quite complex combination of elements that results in the project, not in a cause-effect way, let's say, not in the narrative structures that we're used to architects using. And I think in that way you could say the project is a remarkable kind of registration of this technological comprehension of the architectural object that now extends beyond the building materials, beyond the concrete, beyond their finishes, to the forms of knowledge, to the epistemology that's being deployed for not just their creation, but their explanation. And that kind of technological dimension to the work, I find a staggering demonstration of the book as much as the building. Right? And the book, of course, is famously the technology that architects have long relied
It's
on.
always interesting how each of us imagines that our task is the task. You, the producer of the book, is now extolling the incredible power and effectiveness of the book. It's probably, and you're probably right. I think, for example, you're wrong that the Maison Domino was the most influential project in the 20th century. What was the most influential thing in architecture in the 20th century is that one structural perspective, that drawing. Because I would bet, not even you, and you've done the book, or maybe you've done the book, we'll find out if you're a good editor, actually remember what the project was about, and what the drawings look like. So, so the incredible power of that thing was not the book, not even the project, not even the architecture. I show, in every slide lecture I do, I show the pictures of the Maison Domino that he drew, sketched out. I make the faculty, from whatever school I'm at, name the support project. No one could ever name it. So it's not quite true that the book is the most important thing. Sometimes it's the book, sometimes it's the building, sometimes it's a drawing, sometimes it's this quote. But there is an ecology of these exchanges. Any species in the ecology can go extinct, and will be replaced by another, and the niches will reform. To imagine it works in any sense as part of whole relationships and with a hierarchy of importance would be to misunderstand how it actually functions socially. I mean, I have a very simple agenda for what I think architecture should do in life. And I suspect everyone else does here too. Although don't expect this the same agenda. So I don't want to win. I want to set it in motion. And I think that's a better way to think about our, like, I know it's clear now, for example, I don't want to get into the whole, actually he kept talking about reception at the end of the book. And I thought that meant we were going to go get some wine. I'm watching that poor guy, 2 cups of coffee, read his email 4 times, just ready to go. So maybe we're go. It's fun to be on the stage and talk about something. I can't shut up right now. It's harder to sit there. Y'all got questions? I have no questions. Ask questions. Like, is it over yet?
So you're talking about copies a little bit.
You're the guy from MIT that had to have these.
So you do this building and you do a book about it, and then presumably it's copied here and there around China, wherever. Do you think there's something special about your building that deserves a book, or is that like the handbook of how to make your building, or is it declaration of its originality or something? You know, is your original better than, because the problem of authorship, I think, is that like the field always can do it better than the original author can. So
you have a naive notion of originality. Which came first, you or your father?
So, well,
Seriously, I mean,
no, but that's part of my question is,
it's the copy that
does it,
It's the copy
that makes the original. Sure.
It doesn't stop the original from being an original. So, if what you're saying is correct, if it's an act of originality, it's an act to set into motion the forces that will allow it to become an original.
And the book is meant to basically pave the way.
It's mobilize it. It's one of the forces in the field. I don't think it's the most important one, but it's one of the important forces in the field that keeps the economy of exchanges in motion. Remember now, any good economist will tell you it's not quantity of capital, it's velocity of capital that matters. So, in ecology, it's about how fast things eat each other, not what they are. And then ecology. So I think it's a really good question, but it sounded like it had inverse values.
Good questions. Who else?
Here.
For symmetry, one on this side. Anybody
I
over
want
there?
somebody from Iran.
Oh my god.
I know everybody.
Yeah, I got it.
I know everybody
Hello. Actually, I was wondering, when you were saying copying, I kind of don't understand the word copy anymore, because it doesn't make sense to say copy. Years ago, you could say copy, you would put something here and then look at it and then imitate it. But nowadays, like I do a project, after 5 months I see someone build it like a month ago.
But you feel bad about that.
Yeah, you cannot put it in your portfolio. You go like, oops, someone thought about this last year. It's
I would just put
embarrassing.
the other guy's project in my portfolio. Relabel it.
Yeah, but the thing is that sometimes people have the same idea. Maybe they're not connected. Maybe you have never
Don't you
seen
think
it.
that's fantastic? Don't you think, Colin, that you've described the miracle of creative life is for you to think of something, an idea, you don't know anybody else's stuff, you sit down and draw it, and then you find out that 10 other people have done the same thing. You don't find that deeply moving metaphysically?
I do, but many people judge architects for that. They don't know maybe this person came to that on their own. For example, the first thing I thought when I saw your building, I'm sorry, but I thought about Toyo Ito-san's building.
Which one?
But Toyo Ito-san's, he has one in, you know.
Probably over against the tower.
Yeah, and it's not that you actually like maybe copied that or anything, but that's the first thing that comes
Now,
to
let me
my
ask you-
mind.
Okay, good, great. Now that you've got the comparison, what are the differences? I mean, the comparison is born in the sense of the similarities. Now the discrimination and the mobilization of the discourse comes in your articulation of the differences, paying really close attention to the small differences. Those small differences will become the only important thing, and then new architecture will get born from that small attention to small details, and then leaps of creativity from them. It's literally going to be at the level of 2 or 3. Mozart. He had an exercise in which he had to copy symphonies, and he copied the symphony. His Symphony No. 6 is actually an exact copy of a lesser-known composer's symphony, and it's about 1,200 measures. In 2 measures, he changed 2 notes from one instrument to another instrument. And that's it. But you can then trace his change from the woodwinds to the flute, from a woodwind instrument to a metal woodwind instrument, as going through affecting his entire. So the issue is not the similarities. The issue is to hysterically attend to the small differences until they exaggerate themselves into new growth. That's it.
Well, I think that's really important, but I can't say that that's it. I mean, I think that the... No, but I think that we're throwing the word original around very loosely. And, if you took 014 apart, presumably at some moment you would get down to standardized components somewhere, hardware, the door that you hate, etc. So nothing is singularly what it is in that way. And I think that that's another minor difference to which one ought to be really attentive. So somehow we think of the master creator as being in control of all of those things, or having some original intention to which the thing then originally lives up. I mean, what is the point of origin of the original? I think it's a totally loose and, on some level, hysterically useless concept.
No, it's very interesting. I remember having to write a piece on the student center, Bernard's, at Columbia, the Learner Hall. And there were all of the pressures that Bernard was under by the board and people from Washington University, that he had to come harmonize that building with the McKinney plan, that he had to use the materials of the campus, he had to kind of extend string courses, all of that. I'm sure he had no idea that he was going to generate a postmodern building, but much of the building is. So I think there's a level of...
The glass will nose.
Yeah, all of that stuff, he was still, trying to keep it modern, but actually he was producing something more and more postmodern, more and more historicist postmodern, without, making that a virtue of the project. It just happened. So you realize that, I don't know if this has been your experience as an architect, but you realize you're channeling a lot of impersonal stuff when you do, when you design. You suddenly find, oh, these are the set of circumstances that produce a core. I'm suddenly doing it, and I don't even know how it happened, but it's, it's that coming together of a certain set of constraints and of issues that then produce what you think is personal. But it's the most impersonal thing in the world.
And besides, generally, any project, any building, maybe not a project, generally begins with a client, with a competition. It exists long before the architect gets there, as a general rule, right? So before the architect is even born to be original, there's already a very complicated process of negotiation that goes on.
Increasingly, according to Alejandro, so limiting as to define the role of the architect in narrower terms. When the Shenzhen airport that he showed, if you look at the 5 competitions, they're shockingly identical simply because they got handed a plan and they couldn't deviate from it. And really all they could do is decide to see.
I have to,
But then those were the small differences that made it very distinct.
But also,
look at a Greek temple. Excuse me, I could show you 25 Greek temples, and you're not going to be able to tell the difference. I tell you, I could return.
Can I ask you a question about your comment? Just one. I really have one question. Okay. I don't mean to interrupt. Wasn't emphasis supposed to make the columns not disappear? I mean, in a sense, look
Straight.
Yeah, so no wonder nobody noticed it for 2,000 years.
They worked.
It worked.
That's what I'm saying, it's a shell game. The point of a shell game is that it works.
So it had to be fallen over till you see the fat bellies.
There's a lot of arguments about why it was noticed, but one of them is the camera.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
I mean, Sylvia, what seems interesting in the shell game analogy, and as you were presenting it, what I was struck by was its potential actually to offer not misreadings of known problems, which is almost what you couched the discovery in. You know, coming back to a figure ground thought in a different way, an old, tired problem from many people's point of view, but now suddenly thought differently through the ingenuity of a particular reading. But the shell game offering the possibility for a sleight of hand that hasn't been seen before, i.e. a category of problem that's different than, let's say, the structure decoration that Jesse presented, the figure ground that you were relying on, or some of the examples Jeff had. I think that's one of the perennial questions around the assumption of a disciplinary project. The discipline is defined by a fixed set of problems versus ways of working in which what are being discovered actually are new kinds of problems rather than new interpretations or unexpected readings of existing problems. And I'm just wondering on that front, if, you know, in the nature of where you see the disciplinary project right now, whether such things might be emerging.
Well, I mean,
Or being pushed through particular...
I mean, disciplinarity is a kind of historical term, right? So that one's difficult to extract from that. But the virtue of disciplinarity is that it is insofar as it gives you tools for dealing with new problems. And so when we've been talking about being attentive to differences, I mean, I think it's also important to be attentive to similarities. So in the discussion, for example, about the constraints, the overdetermination of architectural projects today. I mean, frankly, I think for a lot of architects, that's a poorly examined historical fiction. That's what I was saying about a Greek temple. There is nothing more determined, overdetermined, predetermined, limited for the architect than a Greek temple. And I mean, it's as old as anything, so it actually tells you it's just actually not true to say that it's overdetermined today. And repeating that frees you from the obligation to understand exactly in what ways is it determined today and not. It's a complete abdication of responsibility to be attentive to those differences.
I mean, one of the responses I'd have listened to the presentations, though, is what's interesting is you each touched on, I'm thinking of the problem of the appearance of the building in the desert and its rendered status. And the uneasiness felt, each of you expressed that in different ways. And this is certainly something we talked about in the production of the monograph. That is, in a way, a very, very contemporary sensibility. Not emerging new and unexpectedly, but
how did the building look like it's rendering?
Sorry?
I'm curious what you're saying.
What's new is the critical questioning of that confusion, that inability to distinguish the one from the other, which arguably on a daily basis we all experience in kind of random form. And certainly architects talk about it that way also. But I was interested that you're all doing work on that problem in quite interesting and unexpected ways.
Yes, that's right. The problem with this is, of course, we do this all the time, 24 hours a day. We're going to do it dinner. We can keep doing this. I don't care if we're done. I just want to go get a drink. I mean, but for example, I think the idea that I'm glad buildings are starting to look like renderings. The thing is, I think renderings aren't interesting enough. So but I like the way architecture has always chased its drawings, building the perspective into the effect of the architecture. And so we draw a picture of a reality that doesn't exist. We love the picture, then we turn the reality into that becomes our reality. I think that's a really good, I think that's a kind of a disciplinary project today. Do you know, have you ever seen on Google Earth or whatever, sometimes you'll see a bridge will go down like a little texture map on the floor. What I'm thinking you guys ought to do is go around the world, find every one of those things, and actually build the things like that. So when we get there, it looks like the Google. I want it to look like the more, we can finally count on it to look like the renderings, I don't have to go anywhere.
But one of the things that's different about the relationship, I mean, I think that that holds true, and here you would probably want a real historian to tell you where there's a break. No, because I think that one of the things that's different today is that most architects, when they show projects, they show their renderings and apologize for them. And they distance themselves. Well, I didn't really mean to make the rendering. I'm sorry I made the rendering. I had to make the rendering. The client needed the rendering. And so they use the rendering as a kind of repository for all the evils in the world and pretend that in fact it's exactly what they're running away from rather than chasing. So there's again more than one set of narratives that's being constructed around that, and that's what makes the problem new.
Well, but there's also careers emerging that are doing nothing but rendering for the obvious reasons that it's a much more highly rewarded job than building buildings. And young architects across Europe who are doing nothing but spending 24 hours a day rendering their own work, not for other architects, not to make an image of a building that will be built, but arguing that that's a project today within architecture.
One of the best ways to get a job out of architecture is to render for Danes. Basically, to design and render architecture. Somebody's got a pocket flask with some vodka in it.
This is a really interesting point because sorry, I didn't catch up.
I said, you don't have a pocket flask with some vodka in it.
That would be something.
I do actually. It is a really interesting point because I think if you look back hundreds of years, we had the most beautiful renderings of projects, right? And then amazing drawings. They look very realistic, right, and beautiful. And then in the 20th century, when I was started architecture as well, I mean, very abstract drawings, beautiful line drawings, but never rendering reality. And then now, as you say, I mean, I get, in my office, I get at least one, if not 2 or 3 per week. I get emails, we would like to do your renderings. Right? From mostly Chinese, but also Portuguese offices all over the world. And I do have to agree with you that architects apologize for their renderings. I know a lot of architects who don't apologize, and it's actually, but it probably depends on the audience. But it's actually a very, almost a means of that's been thought, become a standard to get your projects, right? To be with a highly realistic rendering out there. Otherwise, the developers are so there's, you know, you can lose the project because of that. And I would like to, just throw that in because
Do you have to do animations too?
Yeah, but the more realistic, the better, in terms of the
development. What you're saying is the closest they appear to imitate experience, the better they are for the client, even though we all know that they come nowhere near imitating experience.
Sure.
So, but do you worry about that?
Do I worry about it?
Yeah.
No.
What, I mean,
Except that they produce a new form of experience, which will in turn become one of the filters through which we have other kinds of experiences. So they're not to be neglected. I mean, I don't think that they're what architecture chases anymore, but they're an important part of the ecology in which architecture operates.
And in fact, there are legal and other frameworks around that kind of operation today in cities in Europe, where because the renderings that are being made at a level of precision much higher than the construction industry, preservation opponents have filed suit against many projects that weren't as accurate as the original rendering because of the tolerance and the height of the building, that it exceeded an envelope. And there's an incredible form of expertise around that that goes not just from the renders, but to the lawyers to negotiate what we all see as the realm of possibility to accomplish the sort of projects that you guys are doing in the desert.
And the money that goes into the rendering is highly disproportionate to the amount of work that the architect put in.
did you come all the way from Australia just to hear this?
I think we've got one more rendering here. We're going to draw it to a close because we've got this lovely rendering upstairs for you all to see. Instead of pictures of the book, I think if I understand it right, we've got some copies up there. Thank you, everybody, for the time today. All the participants this evening, thanks so much. And let's go upstairs and have a drink together.
But could I, just to make an announcement, I just want to thank everybody for Jeff and Jesse, Brett, Nanako, and Sylvia for tonight. Just to continue, this symposium will be curated. It will be put together as a form of publication some point next year. So I just want to let you know that this is not the end of it. This is in fact to be reinterpreted in some other way, to be kind of curated, to see how this form of symposia could become the catalyst for building architectural directions. I just want to thank you, everybody. And there's a book sales on the back of this auditorium. So if those are interested in, oh, actually, it's over here. Sorry. If those are interested in, please join in. Thank you.